I want to thank the American people for the extraordinary honor of being elected your 47th president and your 45th president. This is a magnificent victory for the American people that will allow us to make America great again.
Final counts are still being tallied across the country, but Americans have chosen their next president, Donald Trump. Vice President Kamala Harris will address her supporters and the nation soon. You can see this live image of Howard University. That is where her supporters gathered last night and where she will soon speak. We'll bring that speech to you live. I'm Libby Casey, and this is coverage from the Washington Post. Here are the latest results. Donald Trump has so far clinched 292 electoral votes compared to Harris's 224. That puts Trump comfortably past the threshold he needs to secure the White House. Donald Trump makes history. He's only the second ever ex-president elected. He's the first elected after a criminal conviction, and he will be the oldest ever inaugurated at 78. Trump promised to root out the enemy from within the country. He promised mass deportations, and he also promised to fix the economy. He will enter office with a Republican Senate supporting him. We're still watching the balance of power in the House, and that will be a significant question about whether or not the House goes Republican, because it could mean a trifecta of power in Washington. I'm joined today by Rhonda Colvin, senior political correspondent, also James Hohmann, opinions columnist, and from Mar-a-Lago in Palm Beach, Florida, Leigh Caldwell, co-author of The Early Brief. And right here at Howard University, where Harris will shortly address supporters, we have senior video journalist J.M. Rieger. So, Rhonda, the outcome of the election is really a disaster for Democrats. What will you be listening for Kamala Harris to say today?
Yeah, I'm looking to hear if Vice President Harris will talk about the future. You know, when we hear these speeches where they thank their supporters, they thank the many people who donated, there usually is a graciousness, but I'm wondering if Harris is going to speak to the future, her future, the Democratic Party future. Mm-hmm. I think that this is really going to be, of course, one of her most incredible and most important speeches she's going to give in her entire career.
Let's go to James, who's at our touch screen. James, let's talk about how we've gotten to this point less than 24 hours after the polls closed on election night.
The blue wall crumbled and there was a red wave, a Trump wave. Millions of fewer people voted for Kamala Harris than voted for her and Joe Biden 4 years ago. And Kamala Harris did well in the suburbs. She did as well with women as Joe Biden did 4 years ago. But Donald Trump used a multiracial coalition of working class Latinos, African Americans, and whites, especially men, to win the industrial Midwest, to win the South, North Carolina and Georgia. And shockingly, in 93% of counties in America, Trump actually did better percentage-wise than he did 4 years ago. So the blue wall crumbled, and now the only thing left to call is in the Southwest, Arizona and Nevada. It seems like Donald Trump has a close to insurmountable lead in the Silver State. We're still waiting on some more ballots from Clark County, where Las Vegas is traditionally a Democratic stronghold. But Trump has a strong lead here. And in Arizona, we still only have 61% of the vote. But Trump has taken a meaningful 4-point lead. And we'll see if enough votes come in from Maricopa County, which is where Phoenix is, has about 2/3 of the population in the state, to put Kamala Harris on top. But even if that happens, it's moot, because Trump already has 292 electoral votes. He is likely to get more. He is probably going to be the first Republican to win the popular vote since 2004. He very well could end up with more electoral votes than any Republican presidential candidate since George H.W. Bush in 1988. And this is a major, close but resounding victory for Trump and his movement.
Thanks so much, James. Let's head to Howard University and senior video journalist J.M. Rieger. J.M. was reporting from there last night at the Kamala Harris watch party that eventually dwindled. Cedric Richmond came out, one of the folks from the campaign, and said, the vice president will address you all tomorrow. That moment is here. J.M., how are you reflecting on the little more than 100 days of Kamala Harris's really historic presidential campaign?
Yeah, she was really given a Herculean task in many ways, Libby. 107 days from the day Joe Biden dropped out until Election Day. That's what Harris had to introduce herself to voters and to try and build that coalition before Election Day. And, you know, even last night here at Howard, it was striking how the mood changed over hour by hour. When we came in last night, early evening, there was electricity in the air. At one point over the loudspeakers, you can hear the music right now. The music was blasting last night as well. At one point, the MC said, are you ready to make Black history tonight? The mood there was positivity in the air. And as the night progressed, the tension increasingly filled the air, and it was palpable. And as we've come in here today, Libby, before Vice President Kamala Harris makes these remarks in a few moments right behind me, there is a sense of disbelief among the folks in attendance here today. My colleague Amber Ferguson and I have seen multiple people in attendance who are crying, consoling each other, hugging, embracing one another, and there is a sense of sadness, dejection, and what comes next. And you know, I think folks here are hoping to hear from the Vice President of what does come next.
All right, thanks, J.M. Let's bring in Jeff Stein, White House economics reporter. Jeff, thank you for being here. So many questions for you. Let's talk about what motivated voters, what we've learned from the exit polls in terms of their perspective on the economy.
Yeah, I mean, I think every single reporter in this newsroom thinks that what they cover is the most important thing. I also think that, but in my case, I'm correct. The exit polls demonstrated that something close to 70% of voters either thought the economy was poor or not good. Those are numbers that are extraordinarily difficult for an incumbent to win under, and it captures really this sense of anger and frustration from the Biden administration and other Democrats that they feel like that number should be higher, that unemployment is low. The U.S. has had the best economic recovery of any country in the Western world from COVID. Unemployment, as I said, is very low, and they're seeing a lot of success and payoff from the investments they've made in chips, in infrastructure, and clean energy, and the fact that such huge majorities, even larger than I think any of us expected, still said that the economy was in a bad place is something that many people are going to be studying for years, trying to understand exactly what that was, given the underlying economic data. There are economists, I should say, who think that this frustration is well-founded, that people have lost ground in the last few years. And there are certainly tens of millions of people who are genuinely worse off than they were, especially in the last year, you know, in 2019 under Trump. But the level, the degree of the outrage is something that I think is hard for a lot of economists to understand.
What do we know so far about how inflation factors into that? Because inflation is something that is so palpably felt when you go to the store, when you buy things in your regular routines.
Yeah, it's clearly the principal factor in frustration with the economy. There's this phenomenon that economists have been talking about that they've understood for decades, but was really crystallized by the events of the last few years, where people associate the price hikes around them, the things that they see at the grocery store, the carbs going up, the house prices going up, they see, and I think understandably so, that as being the product of things beyond their control. Their own wages going up, the raise that you get at work, I got a raise in the last few years, you think, and I think also understandably, that that is the product of your own effort, your own sacrifice, your own blood, sweat, and tears. And
in your case, it is, Jeff.
Oh, thanks. There's this mismatch there because both the price hikes and the wage hikes are actually being powered by the same underlying economic forces, but one of them looks to people like something that happened to them.
Totally.
And the other thing looks like something they did. And so that imbalance seems to be sort of fundamental to the story of this election.
Yeah. Stay with us, Jeff. Let's bring in Leigh Caldwell. She was at the Trump campaign election party last night, all the way through the end when Donald Trump came out in the wee hours of the morning and claimed victory. Leigh, what do we know about where Donald Trump goes from here?
Yeah, Libby, I was with you to the end last night. Here we are again. So glad to be here. But what I'm hearing from Trump world is that they are, first of all, basking in their victory, because not that it was a slim victory, that it was what they think pretty much a blowout, that they knew that they were going to do well. They were confident that they were going to win, but they did not necessarily expect they would win with such wide margins and that they would win all 7 battleground states. And so, yes, they are basking in their glory today, but they are also starting to plan for what comes next. There's a lot of conversations happening with the Trump transition team and with the president and with the president's family and campaign advisors on who is going to serve in his cabinet. Those are things that are top of mind, including some key cabinet positions like Secretary of State, Defense Department, Treasury Department. They're also having conversations who are going to liaison between Congress and the White House as well. And so the transition has been started this process and has been working on it for the past few weeks, even couple months, but it was at very base level. They kind of root out the people that they necessarily don't want. But now it is becoming quite serious, and they're looking at the dynamics. How big is the Senate majority? If they have 53 Republican senators, that changes the dynamic for who they're going to be able to try to confirm. They could probably get someone who's much more loyal to the president or much more conservative, as opposed to if there was just a 51-seat majority, but they've surpassed that already. And so these are all sorts of dynamics, but I will say the 2 things that are most important when they're considering this is loyalty to Donald Trump and if they're able to get through the Senate. Libby.
What are sources inside the Trump campaign telling you about what they think helped Donald Trump win?
So everyone has different reasons why they won. I will say the Trump campaign thinks that Kamala Harris was too far left, that she was out of step with the ideological spectrum of where the country is right now. They think that they were adequately able to frame her as a San Francisco liberal and someone who did not relate to most Americans, they say. They also know that the economy was critical, and they tied her to President Biden. And they acknowledge that she really struggled in those key moments, especially when she was asked multiple times, how are you different from President Biden, that she was able to give a believable answer, and especially on that issue of the economy. And then, of course, there is immigration and border security, which is something that has been very difficult for Democrats to run on and to win on in recent elections. A Democrat told me that Democrats are often very afraid of running on their weaknesses, of leaning into their economic successes, of leaning into what has changed on the border over the past few months. And they said that showed last night, Libby.
All right, thanks so much, Leigh. Jeff, what are you going to be watching for in the coming weeks as Donald Trump works through this process that Leigh is talking about of assembling his transition team and floating names for important positions of power?
Yeah, so I've been calling around today to different Trump advisors, trying to get a sense of what they think the big questions here are. The number one question in the sort of econ space is, who will Trump pick as his Treasury Secretary? Last time he had Steven Mnuchin, who was probably most famous for that photo he took with the $100 bills, but really came from sort of a Wall Street background. Trump has talked much more aggressively this time about imposing really high trade barriers on much of the world. Wall Street, the part of the Republican Party that's aligned with Wall Street, really does not like that sort of protectionist impulse of Trump. And so there's back-channeling going on right now by Wall Street, by sort of people in the finance world, to get someone in that Treasury spot who's acceptable to business despite Trump's rhetoric. Now, on the flip side, there's a ton of people who are more closely aligned with the Vice President, J.D. Vance, and who see the Treasury Secretary as a sort of crucial first test of their ability to install a protectionist ally who will take the fight to not just China, but to basically every other trading partner of the U.S. and execute this massive trade war that could drive up prices in a very substantial way. So that's kind of the major fault line that we're seeing thus far.
All right, Jeff Stein, thank you so much. Let's go back to James to talk about the balance of power in the Senate and what we're seeing in some of the latest Senate race calls, James.
Yeah, Libby, today we've been able to call Wisconsin and Michigan for the Democratic incumbents. Those are very significant holds. You can see Republicans have a 52-seat majority, partly because since we went off the air last night, we did call Montana for Tim Sheehy, the challenger to John Tester. So the 3 seats that are still out are Nevada, where Jackie Rosen is currently the Democratic incumbent, trailing Sam Brown in an unexpectedly close race. Arizona, Ruben Gallego has a meaningful lead over Kari Lake, but that would be a Democratic hold. And then the real Senate race that everyone is watching and that is really tight as a tick is Pennsylvania. Now, interestingly, over the weekend, I talked to a top advisor for Dave McCormick, and he told me that if Donald Trump won by 2 points, they would have an ability to win the Pennsylvania Senate race. Donald Trump won Pennsylvania by exactly 2 points. But Bob Casey, the 3-term Democratic incumbent, still has a narrow path. 98% of the vote is in. Interestingly, you can see McCormick is getting 3.3 million votes. Trump got 3.46 million votes. So there's a solid, group of people. Casey, similarly, to a lesser degree, underperforming Kamala Harris. She got 3.37. He's get 3.29. So there were some people who didn't vote. Erie, which we talked about last night, as one of the big battlegrounds to closely watch. Trump actually won Erie, which he had won in 16. Biden had won in 20. But Casey beat McCormick in Erie. It's an interesting county because while it's relatively small, John Fetterman won it in the 2022 midterms by 9 points. And that was critical to his ability to defeat Mehmet Oz statewide. So when you say, okay, like, could Casey still pull it out? He is counting on this. According to a close Casey ally who's tracking all this, they think that there are as many as 300,000 votes that are still out in Pennsylvania, and they believe that about 130,000 of them are in Philadelphia. And so you can see when you go into Philadelphia proper, Casey's currently getting 78%. So if it's true that there are 130,000 votes out and Casey ends up getting about 78% of them, that would mean that statewide he's on track to end up beating Dave McCormick by 16,000 votes. So you can see how close this is. And in a state where 7 million people are voting, it could come down to 10, 15,000 votes.
Thanks so much, James. We're watching Howard University right there on your screen, where Kamala Harris, Vice President of the United States, will address her supporters. We expect her to talk about her defeat by Donald Trump, losing the presidency, something that so many in this crowd gathered here had either worked towards. J.M. Rieger told us that Nancy Pelosi has showed up. There may be staffers there, and maybe Howard University students who were on the cusp of seeing the first Black woman, first South Asian president of the United States. It is not to be, Rhonda.
It is not to be. I think what I'm listening out for is how does she describe her own future? Because if you think about it, I took a look at Hillary Clinton's concession speech back in 2016. She, of course, was the last presidential candidate to concede to Donald Trump. I don't expect it to be the same type of vibe. Remember, Hillary Clinton sort of gave a swan song to the end of her political career. However, Harris is younger at this point right now in her political career. She may have further aspirations to do this all over again. But I'm really interested to see what tone she comes out in. She also has to console the many people who were really energized by her candidacy, her ascension to the top of the ticket so quickly. I know JM noted that it was just over 100 days that she had to put together this campaign for president. And a lot of people, if you would have asked them, you know, after Biden stepped out and she was able to mobilize a lot of people, new volunteers, new donors, if you would have asked people after the DNC and all the energy that happened there in Chicago, if she would lose this way to Donald Trump, they may have been in disbelief. But this race was always going to be tight. But I think really what packs a punch for a lot of people who are waiting there on the lawn at Howard University is that, you know, it was such a defeat to a candidate that her campaign worked hard to strike a contrast between. So a lot of people are really in their feelings right now about this. They looked at Donald Trump as a threat. They remember things like January 6th, and you don't even have to go that far back. Just think about in the last week, some of the concerning rhetoric coming out of his campaign, how angry he has been since Harris was at the top of the ticket and became the nominee, and yet he won this. And also now has a Senate that is backing him and allowing perhaps, you know, a blank check when it comes to confirmations.
And he won it decisively, Rhonda. I mean, he has picked up votes. We're looking to see if he's able to win the popular vote of the people, something, as James has talked about, that a Republican has not managed to do. Donald Trump certainly hasn't been able to do it. He brought people to his side. JM, let's talk about Kamala Harris's team right now and what you're hearing about sort of what happens from here. You know, there's a lot of questions about like the finger pointing and how will people do an autopsy of what this moment means for Democrats. But as you see some of the Democratic leaders gather there, what questions are they asking?
Yeah, Jen O'Malley Dillon sent out a memo earlier today, you know, basically commending the staff for their work in challenging circumstances. That was obtained by our colleague Tyler Page here. We also know that Kamala Harris has called Donald Trump and has conceded and congratulated him on his victory. We know that Joe Biden has called Harris and talked with her, and Joe Biden has also called Donald Trump and congratulated him on his victory. The vice president is en route to Howard University at this point, and you know, the campaign, you can honestly, you can see it just from walking in here because there are a significant number of staff from the campaign here, and there is that air of sort of disbelief in the air, that nervousness, because as Rhonda was just saying, Libby, the campaign and Harris herself over and over again laid out really the stark terms and choices in this election, and the threat that she said Donald Trump posed to the country and posed to U.S. democracy. So how Harris in a few moments here balances that message with this, you know, where we go from here and what, if any, unity can come from this, I think is going to be one of the key things to watch, because and by the way, that message permeated through with voter after voter that we spoke to on the campaign trail at these events. They were all of these voters who were supporting Kamala Harris were worried about the stakes if Donald Trump won. They worried about it from a democracy standpoint. They worried about it from a reproductive health standpoint. They worried about it from an education standpoint in terms of what Trump has said he wants to do in eliminating the Department of Education. So all sorts of issues were coming up depending on which voter you spoke to, and that message was really coming through. So how Kamala Harris addresses her supporters, addresses her staff, and addresses what comes next is really going to be the key to this speech.
Thanks, JM. Joining us now is Michael Birnbaum, State Department correspondent. Michael, let's talk about how the global community is reacting to the re-election of ex-President Donald Trump.
Well, there's a lot of I mean, from traditional U.S. allies in Europe, there's a lot of surprise and disbelief that this has happened again. They have bad memories of Trump's first term. This time they're moving quickly to accommodate, to congratulate, and to try to build a working relationship. In the Mideast, the Israeli government is delighted Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu thinks that Trump will give him much freer rein to prosecute the conflicts in Gaza, in Lebanon right now, and will not push him very hard on Palestinian rights. The Saudis are thinking about what they can do, what kind of deals they can make with the Trump administration. It really is a big realignment of people who had, or countries that had good relationship with the Biden team, and a different cast of characters who expects to profit from the Trump years.
So what do we know about Donald Trump's foreign policy goals and agenda, Michael?
Well, there are two major foreign policy crises right now in the world, and a bunch of smaller ones, but the big ones are in the Mideast, as Israel continues to fight in Gaza and has expanded its conflict in Lebanon, and is also going back and forth with Iran right now in sort of tit-for-tat attacks. It's expected that the outgoing Biden team pretty much has no more leverage, certainly not to push the Israelis on Gaza and to reach a ceasefire deal there. Trump has said he wants peace in the Mideast. He's told the Israelis, we have reported, he's told Netanyahu that Netanyahu should do what he needs to do to prosecute the conflicts. There is some question whether his expectation, Trump's expectation, will be that Netanyahu finishes these wars, these conflicts by January 20th. That could certainly shake things up. But generally the Israelis expect much less criticism from a Trump White House. In Ukraine, that's the other major raging conflict. Certainly the Ukrainians are, they're dealing with losses on the battlefield. They were already being pressed by Russia. Trump has been extremely skeptical of further military aid. He said he wants that war to end. I think there's expectation that there will be some sort of negotiation. The question will be, at what cost to the Ukrainians? What does Trump demand, if anything, from Russian President Vladimir Putin? And what kinds of security guarantees are given to Ukraine, if any, to try to prevent the war from popping up again? So there are a lot of questions right now. I think that we do know certainly that the Trumpian foreign policy will be radically different from Biden's foreign policy. We don't quite know what shape it's going to take yet.
Michael Birnbaum, thank you so much for joining us. Let's go to James Hohmann for the latest on what you're watching, James.
Well, Kamala Harris is giving this speech. Rhonda's talked about how it's one of the most important speeches of her career. It's really striking the degree to which she and Joe Biden are extending a courtesy to the former president that he definitely did not 4 years ago. Donald Trump didn't just deny the election results. He was the first president since Andrew Johnson to refuse to attend his successor's inauguration. Obviously, he incited a mob on the ellipse on January 6th. And what we expect to hear from Vice President Harris is a concession, which we never got from Trump. And in the readout from the Trump campaign, they emphasized, both candidates talked about the need to heal the country and bring people together. We know that Joe Biden reached Donald Trump and invited him to come sit down and visit at the White House. And it is just a striking contrast to what we experienced 4 years ago. And it also is striking when you think about, on January 6th, Kamala Harris is going to be the one who has to certify the election of Donald Trump over herself, the same way Al Gore did in 2000 and Richard Nixon did in 1960.
Leanne, let's talk about that relationship that Donald Trump's going to have with the Harris campaign and this transition here. It really is remarkable when James lays it out that way, Leanne, about how we're back to like the normal operating order of a candidate graciously conceding and things proceeding.
Yeah, that's right. So Vice President Harris called Donald Trump earlier today to concede. Aides say that she talked to him also about a peaceful transition of power. Our colleagues on the White House team say that President Biden is going to attend the inauguration. And it's really a return to what is happened for election after election, presidential transition for many years until the last one that, as we all know, was quite ugly and became very violent under President Trump. And so what is the it seems like the Harris team, the Biden team, is going to try to cooperate as much as possible with the Trump transition. Of course, that's what most transitions say, and it can sometimes be quite rocky and not very smooth. But last time there was very little communication between the Trump White House and the Biden team, and I think that they're trying to make this return back to traditional norms of democracy. Kamala Harris ran on that, and so it's likely that she's going to try to live by that too, Libby.
Thanks so much. Let's bring in Yasmin Abutaleb, White House reporter. Yasmin, what did you notice in the exit polls as people were voting yesterday? What stood out to you in terms of weaknesses for Kamala Harris and the Democrats?
Well, we just published a story looking at just how broad the coalition that Trump built was. And I think that was the most striking thing that we saw from the exit polls. It wasn't just one group that explained how he won. And we do expect that he might sweep all of the battleground states. Michigan was called for him today. That he outperformed with almost every group. And he also cut into key Democratic strongholds. So, I mean, the big story, of course, is the dramatic increase in support among Hispanic voters, but you also saw it across the board. You saw it with middle and lower income voters, with not just white, non-college educated voters, but non-college educated voters across the board. And then he cut into Democratic strongholds. We saw him even in states like New York, far outperforming what he had done in the previous two election cycles. He is on track to win the popular vote, which would be the first time he's done it in 3 presidential cycles. And then he also cut into Democratic strongholds in Philadelphia, in Pittsburgh. He massively ran down margins there. And then in Wisconsin and Georgia, we saw him really run up his margins with rural voters in ways that we haven't seen in the previous election cycle. So even Harris's strength in the suburbs was not enough to overcome the increased strength Trump had in rural areas in those states. So I think really the most remarkable thing that we saw this year is just how sort of decisive his victory was, not just among one or two key demographic groups, but across the board. And I think the question is whether this is sort of a permanent shift in the Republican electorate. This is quite different than what we normally see Republicans win with, or if this is a phenomenon unique to Donald Trump.
It is almost, actually, it's just after 4 o'clock Eastern time. Kamala Harris is pulling up now. She's arrived at Howard University. That is where we will see the vice president speak. You can see folks getting ready now. She is going back to the school that she graduated from, Rhonda, an HBCU, a very storied institution right here in Washington, D.C. So much pride from HBCU students, Howard University students, that one of their own was running for president, was serving as the vice president, and was so close to be elected president. How does she need to think about her message today to her supporters, but also like the future generations who want to see a woman become president someday, who want to see a woman of color become president someday?
You know, I think that might be a part of her remarks that we're expecting very soon. I looked back at Hillary Clinton's remarks when she conceded to Donald Trump, and she did have a line about, you know, making those cracks in the glass ceiling, but they didn't go far enough. I'm wondering if Harris will also take a similar approach to acknowledge the history that her campaign made, and
because she didn't campaign on that history, like it wasn't an identity,
and it wasn't really what voters were voting on. Those supporters of hers felt that took a back seat to what they felt was a very high stakes election.
But it is still part of this moment.
It is, and given the venue that she is having this at, given the people in the crowd, people she may want to inspire to stick with the Democratic Party, she has a role right now in helping energize and keep some energy in the Democratic Party that is, you know, waking up today to a lot of questions about the strategy she had, about how Trump overperformed. You know, she's going to have to speak to the moment and also speak to her own future as well.
And also choices about Joe Biden's to stay in the race as long as he did. James, a big part of Kamala Harris's message was, we're not going back. What happens to that message right now?
This speech is incredibly important, not just for Kamala Harris's own political career, if she is to have a future, but also in setting the tone for what Democratic opposition to Trump will look like the next 4 years. I expect she'll say something like, we always have to fight to preserve our values, but we should work with the other side when it's in the best interests of the American people to get things done. Some kind of threading the needle sort of message. She's going to urge calm. She's going to urge people to stay involved and to be doing grassroots activism. But it is going to be about kind of capturing the right tone where she doesn't sound like she's giving up and isn't urging people to give up, but is also trying to sound gracious.
Yasmeen, we're not going back. And yet, for a lot of people, the country is going back. Trump supporters want to go back, apparently, but this was a warning and also a call for advancement. What happens in your mind to this campaign message and where Kamala Harris goes from here with this, and Democrats go?
I think the Democrats have quite a bit of soul searching and a reckoning to do, because it's not just Donald Trump. They lost the Senate. It looks like, Republicans might be able to maintain control of the House. We don't know yet. And I think there are going to be a lot of questions about Joe Biden's decision not to drop out of the race or not to seek a second term and allow an open primary, what messages they're running on people, whether parts of the party have swung too far left, and to just sort of understand why there was this rightward lurch across the board this year. I mean, the other sort of striking data point that came from the exit polls is that in the counties where at least 90% of the vote was counted, Trump outperformed his 2020 margin in more than 9 out of 10. So that's, the country wanted him back. I think there's a sense that a lot of it was the pre-pandemic economy, that just prices have been too high, and that Harris might have been too closely tied to the administration. She couldn't run as the change candidate while also being the sitting vice president and only having 3.5 months to launch this campaign. So I think there are going to be a lot of questions about what went wrong here, what message the Democrats are sending to voters, why voters don't seem to be buying that in the ways that Democrats need to win, and how they recalibrate.
Rhonda, people are wondering why this finger pointing at Joe Biden. We have to remember that he came into office promising to be like a transitional figure, handing the White House, handing off the Democratic Party to the next generation. So there was a window there where he could have said, I'm not going to run again. And it could have been that open primary process. Maybe it would have ended up being Kamala Harris, maybe not. But Rhonda, could that person, Kamala Harris included, have then become the change figure that America has said in the exit polls? They were really eager to have a change.
It could have, and we'll never know. But of course, he did not step out. She only had a campaign that started, in June, really, in July in earnest. And she had to work with what she was given. I think, every campaign does an autopsy report after they lose. I'm really interested to hear what comes out of this one, because it feels like a lot of people were saying, look, what could she have done more? She went to groups that were, maybe not part of the Democratic base and tried to message to them. She worked very quickly. She went places that Hillary Clinton didn't go to. She had a great debate performance. She was doing podcasts. She was going on Fox News. I mean, the list was very long of all the things that she tried to accomplish. I'm really interested to see what did they blame this on. And the exit poll data that you've been going over is just so fascinating, because when you were saying that Trump overperformed in areas we didn't expect, it's fascinating because he did not run a campaign to have an open tent. He basically talked to his base and made sure that they were the people that would turn out. Yet he still performed well in groups that he really didn't do as well in his previous election. So it's really telling. I think one thing I'm hearing, which is sort of the quiet part out loud, is, was this about the fact that she was a woman? Was this something that, you hear that saying, are people ready for a female president? Is that something that played into
Is America ready for a woman of color president?
Exactly, that too. And when you look worldwide, there aren't that many women leaders as in terms of our NATO allies. So she would have made history in that sense too, but I'm wondering if voters just, wanted to go back to what they knew, and that was that. So I'm not even sure, had Joe Biden said, I'm only going to do a first term, handing things over to her, if he did that earlier enough, if that would have changed the sentiment that a lot of Americans may have had about having a female president.
James, how is this moment different in your experience right now to when so many Americans were shocked when Hillary Clinton lost? And a reminder, of course, she won the popular vote. She lost the Electoral College vote. So more than half of voting Americans wanted her to be president. How is this moment different in terms of like the soul searching, the recalibrating, the reaction to a Donald Trump presidency?
It is very different because that time Donald Trump was very much not in control or full control of the Republican Party, even though he was the standard bearer. Remember, the election was a month after the Access Hollywood tape emerged. A lot of prominent Republicans had called on him to drop out of the race. And as Trump won the presidency in 2016, it was much more unexpected than it was yesterday. Democrats picked up 2 Senate seats, I think 6 House seats, and there weren't the coattails that Donald Trump had this time, but a lot of the recriminations are sort of similar. Bernie Sanders just put out a statement while we have been talking on the air, and it's pretty blistering. He says it should come as no great surprise that the Democratic Party, which has abandoned working class people, would find that the working class has abandoned them. And at the very moment that that statement hit my inbox, I got a breaking news alert from our business desk here at the Post that the Dow closed 1,500 points higher after the Trump win because major indexes, cryptocurrencies, banks, the big banks, Tesla, because it's controlled by Elon Musk, all saw huge spikes today. That's another contrast from 2016, where initially the shock of the Trump victory spooked the markets. This time, Wall Street celebrating the Trump news. And I think that that is a reflection of how Trump is more of a known commodity than he was 8 years ago.
Yasmin, something that's also different is Donald Trump and his team are more prepared to assume the presidency this time. We're already hearing, murmurings of who they would be thinking about putting into positions of power, who would be taking the reins on some of that. How important is that?
It's extremely important because I think we're all bracing for a second Trump term to be radically different from his first term. And I think that's not just even in the appointments, it's in the makeup of the Senate. A lot of these Senate candidates rode Trump's coattails to victories to higher than expected margin victories in some of these states. So this is not a Senate or even a House Speaker like we had with Paul Ryan in 2017, who are sort of skeptical of him and want to try to rein him in. Mike Johnson, the Republican House Speaker, if he remains the House Speaker, has very much tied himself to Trump and his agenda. There has been a lot of work during this campaign with Trump and his various allies in Congress and in the Republican think tanks and figuring out what they're going to do if they were to return to power, of who's going to be in various appointments. I don't think this time we're going to see Trump come in and appoint someone like John Kelly, who will try to restrain him for a year, or go through 4 or 5 chiefs of staff before he finally lands on one that just lets him sort of run free with whatever his impulses are. I think this time Trump sort of infrastructure is very prepared to come in to try to get rid of a lot of sort of nonpartisan civil servants in the government. They have a pretty detailed plan for how they want to eviscerate parts of the federal government and stack it with loyalists. And the White House, I don't think you're going to see anyone who's there to try to rein in some of Trump's worst impulses or try to sort of hew to traditional Republican themes, whether it's on foreign policy or domestic policy. Trump has sort of restacked the party with loyalists and with people who have been remade in his image, including his Vice President, J.D. Vance. So I think this time they're going to go in and probably be able to execute on parts of their agenda, especially if they have unified control of Congress, much, much faster than they were the first time. There won't sort of be these fits and starts that we saw in the first term where he's firing people, then rehiring people, no James Comey. This time, the people that are being talked about for high-level cabinet positions and White House positions are all people who know exactly who Donald Trump is, who largely stuck by him after January 6th and are going to be rewarded with positions now.
We're watching for Kamala Harris to come and address the crowd there at Howard University. She's a graduate of Howard, and this is where her election watch party was held last night. She didn't come out and address the crowd last night. Cedric Richmond instead came out in the early hours of the morning, I believe it was, Rhonda, very late last night, and said that the vice president would be coming to talk to her supporters and to the nation today. Since then, we know that she has called Donald Trump to concede, and she's talked about this peaceful transfer of power, a return to the norms, part of her pledge, but also a real signal to her supporters and to the world about how she thinks this should all be handled. You can see in the crowd there some Howard students, some folks wearing Howard sweatshirts. Also there, we saw Nancy Pelosi, and we have reporting from our colleagues that her husband, Paul Pelosi, is also there with her. Donna Brazile is there, Tom Perez, Jamie Harrison, the DNC chair, and we also saw the D.C. mayor, Mayor Bowser, there in the crowd. Rhonda, what does this moment mean to the people gathered there today?
Well, you know, they want to hear from the person that they've been supporting for the last few weeks, and she's going to have to
It's really just a few weeks. I mean, it's just the campaign's only been over 100 days for her.
Yeah, and she's going to have to address these people who had so much energy, so much hope that this would turn out differently. And I really think, as Yasmin was talking about control in Congress right now, it appears with the Senate going Trump's way, that also is sort of insult to injury for a lot of Democrats right now, that there appear that there won't be as many checks on a second Donald Trump administration. The only check that we're still possibly looking for is perhaps the House going Democrat. But even then, that would mean that there is going to be a lot of tension between both chambers. Democrats won't be able to get much done. Trump will likely be emboldened to bring forward, as you said, candidates who he would probably not have gotten forward in that first administration. He also has the Supreme Court also at his back. So all things seem to be going for Donald Trump, and that also is an insult to injury for folks like, you know, Nancy Pelosi, who has been there, who led the impeachment efforts twice when he was president. So
and whose husband was attacked by
that too,
someone who was spurred on by hateful rhetoric and language.
Yeah,
and he has this presidential immunity ruling now from the Supreme Court, which I think could further embolden him.
Yeah.
James, we're seeing preparations made on stage here, so I may have to interrupt you, but let's talk about the people in the crowd and what it means for them to be here at this moment.
Yeah, you know, it's funny, the person who's coming onto the stage now, she's wearing one of the retro Kamala Harris for the People shirts from her 2019 short-lived presidential campaign. But I will tell you that in the run-up to Tuesday, it was one of the hottest tickets in town. Every Democrat wanted to be at the rally where she was going to potentially declare victory because they were all angling for jobs in a potential Harris administration. So there was a lot of posturing over who from the Biden White House might have a role in the Harris White House. And so that's why it was very noteworthy that Tom Perez, for example, was invited to come to this event and was given a VIP seat. Now, of course, Kamala Harris will not be president, but of course, these folks are still there, and we'll never know who she might have stocked her government with.
We're still watching some of these race returns come in. James, talk to us about what is still outstanding.
So the big outstanding votes are still in the Southwest, Arizona and Nevada. It does really feel like Republicans have an advantage in Nevada in the Senate race, but we're still waiting on some ballots. There were some ballots that were sort of mistabulated by one of the counties, so that's led to some adjustments. It's made it too soon for us to call either of these Senate races. There's only about 60% of the vote in from Arizona. And Pennsylvania, as I explained earlier in our show, remains too close to call. In the House, it could end up taking a few weeks. California is slow. You're allowed to mail your ballot in, and it can arrive up to 5 days after the election, as long as it was postmarked by Election Day. So in some House races that could be close, that could determine control of the lower chamber, we may have to wait literally a couple weeks to decide who is going to be in the majority. But it does feel like you'd rather be Republicans than Democrats when you look at the seats that are still out and the votes that are still out. And that will obviously go a long way to determine just how much of his agenda Donald Trump will be able to advance.
All right, the speech is on the podium. We have reporting from our colleague JM that someone had to call for a medic for a moment there in the crowd. So we're waiting to see if this is a pause or if they'll get moving ahead shortly. But we'll listen for Kamala Harris to give a speech that will likely go down in history and go down in memory. Hillary Clinton's concession speech certainly did. She also spoke to her supporters the day after Donald Trump defeated her in 2016. Rhonda, are the women who supported Hillary Clinton, then supported Joe Biden, and now supported Kamala Harris, are you going to be watching to see how they react in terms of mobilizing, running for office? We saw a huge march on Washington in the aftermath of the Donald Trump victory back in 2016. It's a different moment now, and people are also more sort of weathered and perhaps hardened in both good and bad ways to this experience.
You know, I think that that's something that we'll see a clearer view as it goes on with the Trump transition, as we know what type of people he chooses to head up agencies, how much people feel like they are being threatened or their rights being threatened. That is an interesting question. I remember writing a story actually in 2016 when Trump first won his first administration, and it did energize a lot of women to get involved. I remember groups like Emily's List making sure to mobilize women and finding women in rural districts across the country to vote and take over seats at the local level and also at the congressional level. So, you know, when people do feel that their rights are at stake and they're in danger, that does mobilize them. But that will be something interesting that we should be watching as we get a sense of what this Trump administration looks like.
What will you be watching for here, Yasmin, in the next couple of weeks?
I think the biggest thing is to see how Democrats, how they make sense of this loss, where the blame ultimately lies, and sort of just initial conversations. I haven't heard a lot of blame placed at Kamala Harris's feet. It seems there's much more anger directed at Joe Biden for dragging out this process and not allowing Democrats to run a primary. And then also just to see who we start seeing in terms of appointments for a Trump White House, how those plans come together, and what Democrats do. I mean, they are going to go into a second Trump administration, like Rhonda said earlier, with not a lot of power. So, you know, who does Trump think he can get through Senate appointments? We've heard some highly controversial names floated for key agency positions. And then I think we also need to see what Democrats' plans are to sort of pick themselves up. And I think they're going to start looking ahead to the 2026 midterms now.
One of the things that will be especially sort of optically interesting and significant is that Kamala Harris will preside over the certification of this next election, which of course was the source of so much controversy because Mike Pence chose to do the legitimate thing and certify the election of Joe Biden. We saw January 6th, the attack and riot at the Capitol. Once again, Kamala Harris is trying to return to the norms, and we have every expectation that this will be part of the American tradition and procedure that has gone on for a long time prior to 2020, Rhonda.
Yeah, that's right. And, you know, the irony, I believe James touched on this too, that this would have not been the case had it been the other way around. We even heard, you know, just as late as earlier this week that the former president was sowing those seeds of doubt, saying this election will be rigged if we don't win it. He had been saying that for weeks, and as a part of a longer playbook that he usually relies on when he feels things may not go his way, and to get his supporters hyped up that Democrats have rigged the election. But at the same time, you will see Harris take that role, transition government in the way that it was intended to be, and that is not necessarily what might have happened if it were the other way around. So, you know, here we are.
There's extra fencing and barricades around where Vice President Kamala Harris lives, the Naval Observatory. There are some glass buildings in downtown D.C. that were boarded up over the last week to protect in case of riots or vandalism. You've talked about the Capitol and how the Capitol has been bracing for any sort of chaos.
Yeah, they've been doing drills in the last few weeks. There are barricades and fencing surrounding it that have been up for weeks. They may still have some security measures in place for January 6th and that joint session that will happen, but it's not likely going to be the same as if it were the other way around. But yes, this is the type of, you know, election day or, you know, election day until inauguration that we've come to expect with the Republican Party sowing seeds of doubt in the election system.
Let's go back to J.M. Rieger. He is there at Howard University. J.M., we're just going to show images of Howard as we talk to you. Can you describe the crowd for us as people have gathered, as it's filled in, and as people wait to hear from Vice President Harris?
Yeah, it has filled in, Libby. There is the far bleachers that's a little split, and there's some applause now as Tim Walz, the vice presidential nominee for the Democrats, is walking in. Everyone is standing up here in the VIP section. And you all were mentioning some of the folks who were here in attendance as Governor Walz and his wife Gwen take their seat in the front row there. There's kind of an anxious anticipation in the air here, Libby, but the crowd has really filled in for the most part, and has gotten close, I would say, just eyeballing it here to where it was sort of at its peak level last night.
Yeah, I just saw Ella Emhoff, she's there. Other family members and relatives, you can see her brother embracing her. The stepchildren of Kamala Harris, and we just saw on Saturday Night Live the skit about riffing off of Mamala. They tried to inject joy into this, Yasmin. Did it translate in terms of the exit polls and what we heard from people?
No, I think it clearly didn't. I think because the exit polls showed it was not just one or two groups, but this sort of broad gains for Trump compared to 2020, that maybe parts of the Democratic base were energized, but it didn't translate.
There's Kamala Harris, the Vice President of the United States, addressing her supporters at Howard University, a challenging moment for the woman who many Democrats and independents had hoped could become the first woman president. Instead, she has conceded to Donald Trump, but this is a moment for her to thank her supporters and talk to the nation. Let's listen.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Good. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you all. Thank you, thank you. Thank you, thank you. So let me say, and I love you back, and I love you back. So let me say, my heart is full today. My heart is full today, full of gratitude for the trust you have placed in me, full of love for our country, and full of resolve. The outcome of this election is not what we wanted, not what we fought for, not what we voted for, but hear me when I say, the light of America's promise will always burn bright. As long as we never give up, and as long as we keep fighting. To my beloved Doug and our family, I love you so very much. To President Biden and Dr. Biden, thank you for your faith and support. To Governor Walz and the Walz family, I know your service to our nation will continue. And to my extraordinary team, to the volunteers who gave so much of themselves, to the poll workers and the local election officials, I thank you all. Look, I am so proud of the race we ran, and the way we ran it, Over the 107 days of this campaign, we have been intentional about building community and building coalitions, bringing people together from every walk of life and background, united by love of country with enthusiasm and joy in our fight for America's future. And we did it with the knowledge that we all have so much more in common than what separates us. Now, I know folks are feeling and experiencing a range of emotions right now. I get it. But we must accept the results of this election. Earlier today, I spoke with President-elect Trump and congratulated him on his victory. I also told him that we will help him and his team with their transition, and that we will engage in a peaceful transfer of power. A fundamental principle of American democracy is that when we lose an election, we accept the results. That principle, as much as any other, distinguishes democracy from monarchy or tyranny. And anyone who seeks the public trust must honor it. At the same time, in our nation, we owe loyalty not to a president or a party, but to the Constitution of the United States. And loyalty to our conscience and to our God. My allegiance to all three is why I am here to say, while I concede this election, I do not concede the fight that fueled this campaign. The fight for freedom, for opportunity, for fairness, and the dignity of all people. A fight for the ideals at the heart of our nation, the ideals that reflect America at our best. That is a fight I will never give up. I will never give up the fight for a future where Americans can pursue their dreams, ambitions, and aspirations, where the women of America have the freedom to make decisions about their own body and not have their government telling them what to do. We will never give up the fight to protect our schools and our streets from gun violence. And America, we will never give up the fight for our democracy, for the rule of law, for equal justice, and for the sacred idea that every one of us, no matter who we are or where we start out, has certain fundamental rights and freedoms that must be respected and upheld. And we will continue to wage this fight in the voting booth, in the courts, and in the public square. And we will also wage it in quieter ways, in how we live our lives, by treating one another with kindness and respect, by looking in the face of a stranger and seeing a neighbor, by always using our strength to lift people up, to fight for the dignity that all people deserve. The fight for our freedom will take hard work, but like I always say, we like hard work. Hard work is good work. Hard work can be joyful work. And the fight for our country is always worth it. It is always worth it. To the young people who are watching, it is, I love you. To the young people who are watching, it is okay to feel sad and disappointed, but please know it's going to be okay. On the campaign, I would often say, when we fight, we win. But here's the thing. Sometimes the fight takes a while. That doesn't mean we won't win. That doesn't mean we won't win. The important thing is don't ever give up. Don't ever give up. Don't ever stop trying to make the world a better place. You have power. You have power. And don't you ever listen when anyone tells you something is impossible because it has never been done before. You have the capacity to do extraordinary good in the world. And so to everyone who is watching, do not despair. This is not a time to throw up our hands. This is a time to roll up our sleeves. This is a time to organize, to mobilize, and to stay engaged for the sake of freedom and justice and the future that we all know we can build together. Look, many of you know I started out as a prosecutor, and throughout my career, I saw people at some of the worst times in their lives. People who had suffered great harm and great pain, and yet found within themselves the strength and the courage and the resolve to take the stand, to take a stand, to fight for justice, to fight for themselves, to fight for others. So let their courage be our inspiration. Let their determination be our charge. And I'll close with this. There's an adage an historian once called a law of history, true of every society across the ages. The adage is, only when it is dark enough can you see the stars. I know many people feel like we are entering a dark time, but for the benefit of us all, I hope that is not the case. But here's the thing, America, if it is, let us fill the sky with the light of a brilliant, brilliant billion of stars. The light of optimism, of faith, of truth, and service. HU. And may that work guide us, even in the face of setbacks, toward the extraordinary promise of the United States of America. I thank you all. May God bless you, and may God bless the United States of America. I thank you all.
Kamala Harris and her husband, Doug Emhoff, walking off to Beyonce's song, Freedom. She thanked her supporters, called for resolve, and she acknowledged the emotions of the moment. Kamala Harris pledged a peaceful transfer of power because, of course, she still serves as vice president. We saw tears from a lot of people in the crowd at Howard University, including from her running mate, Tim Walz, and her husband, Doug Emhoff. Rhonda, what does this moment mean for Vice President Harris and for America?
Well, you know, as you just noted, it does appear to be a very moving speech to those in attendance. And, you know, it seems as if she did strike that balance of speaking about the future, not only her own future, but also the future of the people there in attendance. I think there were some lines that really stood out to me. One was when she said she does concede, but she does not concede the fight that fueled this campaign. That's pretty forward-looking. That doesn't sound like someone who is leaving the political arena after this election. She also said this is a time we need to roll up our sleeves. I think one of the more moving lines was near the end when she said some Americans believe we're about to enter a dark period, and that is very true, that people are feeling that way today. But she said, let us fill the sky with light. And she left on a very optimistic note, more optimistic than perhaps many of her supporters feel right now. I also think, you know, her shout out to young people, knowing that they fueled a lot of her campaign and a lot of that energy and potentially the future of the Democratic Party. She said sometimes the fight takes a while. You know, that was a part of her campaign trail mantra, is that when we fight, we win. But she's saying sometimes the fight takes a while. But, you know, there was one line that it probably had a lot of weight to a lot of Democrats who might have been listening when she said, when she called the president-elect Donald Trump, she said, we will help you in the transition and we will engage in a peaceful transition. Why that's so striking is because that is not, she's speaking to a person where that did not happen when he lost, and may have not happened had he lost this time around. So that, again, is a part of the weight that a lot of Democrats and a lot of her supporters, remember, she also had disaffected Republicans who wanted to see her administration go forward. She had independents. That is something that a lot of people are, you know, just isn't sitting well with them right now, is knowing that she had to concede to someone who would not have done that for the American people had it been the other way around.
JM Rieger is there at Howard University. JM, what is it like there as the crowd starts to filter out and as Kamala Harris says thank you and goodbye to the 2020 election?
You could see the crowd and behind me here, they were hanging on every word of her speech there, and there was the full range of emotions as she struck some notes of optimism and hope at times in that speech, and there were a smattering of applause throughout, and you could sense kind of the uplifting vibe, especially towards the end of the speech, among the folks behind me. The VIP section, which is right behind me, which is where we saw some of those folks filing in, like House Speaker Emerita Nancy Pelosi, DC Mayor Muriel Bowser, and others. They were on their feet the entire time throughout that speech. And it's notable, Libby, because we've been talking throughout about the history of this moment and the historical nature of her candidacy and the fact that this happened at Howard University, not only where she's an alumna, but where this is occurring in front of the Frederick Douglass Memorial Hall, right over my left shoulder here. And this is something where she wrote in her memoir about how when she was at Howard, she felt like the message was anything is possible. Anything is possible for her as a young black woman. And it seemed at times like she was trying to get that theme across as she struck this sort of upwards note, hopeful note towards the end of that speech, and you could see the crowd was really engaged throughout.
Very emotional crowd there leaving. James Hohmann, let's go to you to talk about this moment. Kamala Harris has totally found her voice. I mean, you could really hear her personality. You could hear her, like her compass and what guides her. You could hear how she's rallying people. Even though some, perhaps a majority of Americans who voted did not vote for her, James, and some still had questions about her, Kamala Harris has a voice that can go on from here in American politics.
Yeah, Kamala Harris really set the tone for a peaceful but spirited resistance to Trump 2.0. And she clearly believes that she should be a leader of that resistance, not just keeping it broad and general about keeping in the fight and activism, but mentioning specifically abortion rights, gun violence, and the rule of law. there's not necessarily a natural place for her to go after she leaves the vice presidency on January 20th. But in some ways, you could say that was potentially the first speech of a 2028 run for the Democratic nomination. Now, that said, I do not think that the path would be clear for her at all. I think she would face a spirited primary campaign, although she would come in as the front runner with a lot of advantages, including name recognition and donors. But she clearly does not want to leave politics. She clearly doesn't want to go take a job on Wall Street or in Hollywood. She clearly wants to stay in this fight. And the question is, to what extent do Democrats want her to? After 2016, Hillary Clinton kept her head down for a couple of years, has sort of reemerged as a force more recently, someone who is out there. It will be fascinating to see what role Kamala Harris plays as a leader of the opposition. Democrats have Hakeem Jeffries in the House and Chuck Schumer in the Senate, but she really could still be around, but in what capacity, that remains unclear.
JM, let's go back to you one more time here as we're still seeing these crowds there at Howard. So much vibrancy and so much emotion, too, especially among the young people, but certainly not exclusively from them, JM. We saw Doug Emhoff really just giving into the emotion of the moment as he watched his wife take the stage and talk about what the campaign has meant for her and for their family. What are you going to be watching here in the coming weeks as Democrats regroup and figure out what a Trump presidency means for them?
It's really notable, Libby, because Kamala Harris, this campaign really laid out the choices and the stakes of this election at about as high of a level as you could put it at. At one point down the stretch saying that she believed Donald Trump was a fascist, right? So, that's about as elevated of rhetoric as you can get in terms of what is on the line. They repeatedly emphasized down the stretch what a threat they believed he posed to U.S. democracy and the rule of law. Democrats, campaign officials, voters, attendees, I think there's still kind of a shell shock feeling here. You can feel it here. It's palpable. We've seen it over the last few hours here in terms of folks embracing one another, holding hands. Some people have been crying, and I think that Harris in her speech just now tried to turn the lens forward, tried to look into what comes next, and trying to keep that hope and optimism and the fight, as she described it, alive and well among her supporters, but among Americans writ large. She did try and strike a unifying tone, I thought, in this speech, and that's notable because even if Republicans are able to retain the House and have unified control, and we don't even know that yet, there's going to be very slim majorities in both chambers of Congress. So it is a situation where they're going to have to work together to get certain things done. And how Democrats approach that task and how Kamala Harris, helps guide the Democratic Party in that task is going to be one of the things that I think we're watching in the months ahead here.
Thanks so much, JM. James, let's go to final thoughts from you on what you're keeping your eye on, especially since there are still races to be called in America.
Yeah, so much of the fear around this election from the left was this notion that the election would be existential for the country. There was this often spoken feeling among some parts of the Democratic coalition that if Kamala Harris loses, there would be no more elections. And I think Kamala Harris was not just trying to say, I'm going to stay in the fight, but trying to reassure Americans that democracy will continue, America will endure, and her line that she said at the top, the light of America's promise will always burn bright as long as we never give up and as long as we keep fighting. What an epitaph for Kamala Harris's campaign.
Rhonda, to you.
While we don't know where Harris goes from here, again, this does not seem like a speech that was written or given by a person who thinks that their political life is over. She was speaking in terms of being very forward-thinking. And to the points we've all made, you know, it does feel to many Americans right now that things may end today for people who are not happy that President Trump won. But the pendulum does swing in politics. So depending on the national mood in the middle of a Trump term, when we'll see the midterm elections also decide the power structure in the House again and the Senate. And when we have another presidential election, you may see a pendulum swing again toward Democrats. But right now, there is that soul searching and there is that decision-making process that party is going to have to do to see where they move forward and where this candidate moves forward.
Thanks so much, Rhonda, James, JM, and all of our guests. Our Washington Post homepage and our app will continue to be updated as vote tallies and races are called and we get more information. We're, of course, watching the balance of power in the House. But for now, President Joe Biden serves out the remainder of his presidency with Kamala Harris by his side, serving out her time as vice president. And we all watch President-elect Donald Trump prepare to take power. I'm Libby Casey. Thank you for joining us for live election coverage here in 2024 from the Washington Post. Take care.
The Washington Post newsroom delivers breaking events around the world as they happen. Unrivaled reporting from the journalists you've come to trust. To get the facts fast and meet the challenges of today head on. Get the news that matters most with a special offer by visiting WashingtonPost.com/watch. Subscribing unlocks instant access, bringing you the Post's award-winning coverage anytime, any place. Because democracy dies in darkness.